My Lai Massacre. On March 16, 1968, in the Vietnamese village of My Lai, soldiers from Charlie Company entered what they believed was a Viet Cong stronghold. Instead of armed fighters, they encountered civilians, women, children, and elderly villagers. What followed was not a battle. Villagers were rounded up and shot. Families were executed at close range. Women were raped before being killed. Homes were burned. Livestock slaughtered. In one irrigation ditch, dozens of bodies were piled together. The exact death toll remains debated, with most estimates ranging between 347 and over 500 unarmed civilians. Amid the violence, Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr., flying overhead in a helicopter, saw what was happening. Realizing civilians were being deliberately targeted, he landed between American troops and survivors, ordering his crew to protect the villagers, even if it meant aiming their weapons at fellow U.S. soldiers. He helped evacuate several civilians to safety. Initially, the operation was reported as a major victory against enemy forces. Only later, through soldier testimony, investigative journalism, and photographic evidence, did the truth emerge. 26 soldiers were charged, but only Lieutenant William Calley was convicted, and he ultimately served just over 3 years under house arrest. Abu Ghraib. In 2004, photographs from the Abu Ghraib prison outside Baghdad shocked the world. The images showed Iraqi detainees stripped naked, hooded, chained, threatened with dogs, and subjected to humiliating and degrading treatment by U.S. military personnel. Investigations revealed that prisoners had endured physical abuse, sleep deprivation, stress positions, sexual humiliation, and in some cases severe beatings. One detainee, Manadel al-Jamadi, died in custody. His death was ruled a homicide. Internal memos had authorized so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, raising questions about how far up the chain of command responsibility extended. The U.S. government initially described the abuse as the actions of a few rogue soldiers. 17 personnel were disciplined and 11 were court-martialed. Some received prison sentences, the longest being 10 years. However, critics argued that higher-ranking officials avoided accountability. In 2006, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Geneva Conventions did apply to detainees in the conflict. Years later, in 2024, a U.S. jury found a private contractor partly liable for facilitating abuse, awarding $42 million in damages to former detainees. Abu Ghraib became a defining symbol of the Iraq War and the global debate over torture and wartime conduct. The Samar Campaign. In 1901, during the Philippine-American War, U.S. forces launched a brutal counterinsurgency campaign on the island of Samar after Filipino fighters killed dozens of American soldiers in the town of Batangas. In response, General Jacob H. Smith reportedly ordered his men to turn Samar into a howling wilderness. According to testimony later presented at trial, he instructed troops to kill anyone capable of bearing arms, defining that as males as young as 10 years old. U.S. Marines and Army units conducted widespread village burnings, destroyed crops, slaughtered livestock, and imposed severe reprisals across the countryside. Entire communities were left without food or shelter. While precise casualty figures remain debated, broader historical estimates suggest that thousands of Filipino civilians may have died as a result of killings, starvation, and disease linked to the campaign. News of the orders eventually reached the United States, triggering public outrage. General Smith was court-martialed in 1902, but not for murder or war crimes. Instead, he was convicted of conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, and received only a formal reprimand before being forced into retirement. The episode became one of the most infamous examples of excess during America's early 20th century overseas wars. Batangas Reconcentration Camps. Around the same time, in the province of Batangas, General J. Franklin Bell implemented a strategy of reconcentration designed to cut Filipino insurgents off from civilian support. Rural populations were forcibly relocated into tightly controlled camps, while their homes, crops, and livestock were systematically destroyed outside the perimeter. The policy aimed to isolate guerrilla fighters, but the humanitarian consequences were severe. Civilians were required to carry identification papers, and anyone found outside designated zones could be treated as hostile. Inside the camps, overcrowding, poor sanitation, and food shortages quickly led to outbreaks of cholera, smallpox, and other diseases. Between early 1902 and mid-year, thousands of civilians died. Some contemporary accounts described conditions as catastrophic, with mortality rates in certain areas reaching alarming levels. Critics at the time compared the system to concentration camps used by other colonial powers. Although officials defended the camps as necessary for pacification and protection of loyal civilians, letters from soldiers and investigative reporting contradicted that narrative. While no senior official faced criminal punishment, the Batangas reconcentration policy became a lasting example of the harsh measures employed during the Philippine-American War. Haditha Killings. On November 19, 2005, in the Iraqi city of Haditha, a roadside bomb struck a U.S. Marine convoy, killing one Marine and injuring others. What happened in the hours that followed would become one of the most controversial incidents of the Iraq War. Shortly after the explosion, Marines stopped a taxi near the blast site. 5 unarmed men were ordered out of the vehicle and shot. Then, Marines entered nearby homes. Inside were entire families, grandparents, parents, and children. By the end of the operation, 24 Iraqi civilians were dead, including women and children as young as 3 years old. Many were killed at close range inside their own houses. The initial Marine Corps report claimed that 15 civilians had died in the roadside bomb explosion and that the remaining deaths occurred during a firefight with insurgents. However, that version quickly began to unravel. An Iraqi human rights worker filmed the aftermath, showing bullet holes inside homes and bodies with gunshot wounds inconsistent with a bomb blast. Medical reports supported that conclusion. Investigations dragged on for years. 8 Marines were eventually charged, but most cases were dismissed or collapsed due to procedural issues and granted immunity deals. In the end, only 1 Marine was convicted, not of murder, but of negligent dereliction of duty, and he received no prison time. For many Iraqis, the lack of accountability became as defining as the incident itself. Nisour Square. On September 16, 2007, in Baghdad's Nisour Square, a convoy of Blackwater contractors, a private U.S. security company working under State Department contracts, opened fire in a crowded traffic circle. Within minutes, 17 Iraqi civilians were dead, and at least 20 more were wounded. Blackwater guards claimed they had been ambushed and acted in self-defense. Iraqi officials and multiple investigations disputed that account. Witnesses described unprovoked gunfire into civilian cars. One vehicle carrying a mother and her adult son was repeatedly shot. Both were killed. An FBI investigation later concluded that at least 14 of the 17 deaths were unjustified. The incident ignited global outrage, not only because civilians were killed, but because the shooters were not regular U.S. soldiers. They were private contractors operating in a legal gray zone. In 2014, 4 Blackwater guards were convicted in U.S. federal court. 1 received a life sentence, and 3 others were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. However, in December 2020, all 4 were pardoned by President Donald Trump, a decision widely criticized by international human rights groups and the Iraqi government. No Ghraib. In July 1950, during the early weeks of the Korean War, hundreds of South Korean refugees gathered near a railway bridge at No Ghraib, fleeing advancing North Korean forces. U.S. troops, fearing that enemy soldiers might be infiltrating among civilians, had received warnings to stop refugee movements approaching their lines. According to survivor testimony and later investigations, U.S. aircraft first strafed groups of civilians near the tracks. Ground troops then opened fire as refugees sought shelter under a railway bridge. For approximately 3 days, men, women, and children remained trapped beneath the bridge, pinned down by gunfire. The exact number of victims remains disputed. South Korean investigations confirmed over 160 named dead or missing, but concluded the true toll was likely between 250 and 300, with nearly half of the victims being children. Declassified U.S. documents later revealed that policies at the time authorized firing on approaching refugee groups in certain situations. In 2001, the U.S. Army acknowledged that civilians had been killed, but described the incident as a tragic result of wartime confusion rather than a deliberate massacre. Survivors, however, continued to argue that orders to fire had been given and that accountability was never fully established. Operation Speedy Express. Between December 1968 and May 1969, the U.S. military launched Operation Speedy Express in the Mekong Delta, a region considered a stronghold of the Viet Cong. Officially, the goal was to disrupt enemy supply lines and reassert control over contested territory. On paper, the operation looked like a decisive success. Around 11,000 enemy combatants were reported killed, while U.S. forces suffered relatively low casualties, but the numbers raised serious questions. Only about 750 weapons were recovered from the dead, a discrepancy that suggested many of those killed may not have been armed fighters. Later estimates by the Army's own Inspector General indicated that between 5,000 and 7,000 civilians could have been killed during the campaign. The operation relied heavily on helicopter gunships, artillery strikes, and air power in densely populated rural areas. Entire zones were declared free fire areas, meaning anyone present could be treated as hostile. Former officers later admitted that intense pressure to produce high body counts contributed to reckless and indiscriminate use of force. Journalistic investigations in the early 1970s concluded that large numbers of civilian deaths had likely been hidden within inflated enemy casualty figures. Sand Creek Massacre. On November 29, 1864, during the American Civil War, U.S. volunteer troops under Colonel John Chivington attacked a Cheyenne and Arapaho village along Sand Creek in present-day Colorado. Chief Blackkettle had positioned his camp there after being told it would be under U.S. military protection. He reportedly raised both an American flag and a white flag to signal peace. Many of the village's warriors were absent at the time. The majority of those present were women, children, and elderly people. Despite this, Chivington's forces opened fire. Survivors and later congressional testimony described civilians shot at close range, bodies mutilated, and some soldiers taking body parts as trophies. Estimates of the dead vary, but most modern historians place the number around 150, with roughly two-thirds believed to have been women and children. Initially reported as a military victory, the attack soon became the subject of federal investigations. Congressional inquiries labeled it a foul and dastardly massacre. Although Chivington's reputation was ruined and he resigned his commission, he was never criminally prosecuted. Sand Creek remains one of the most notorious acts of violence against Native Americans in U.S. history. Wounded Knee. On December 29, 1890, U.S. Army troops surrounded a band of Lakota Sioux near Wounded Knee Creek. Tensions had been rising due to fears surrounding the Ghost Dance movement, which U.S. authorities mistakenly interpreted as a prelude to armed rebellion. Soldiers attempted to disarm the Lakota men, many of whom had already surrendered their weapons. During the search, a struggle broke out involving a deaf Lakota man named Black Coyote, and a gun was discharged. In the confusion that followed, U.S. troops opened fire. Hotchkiss artillery guns were positioned on nearby high ground and began firing into the encampment where women and children were sheltering. Within less than an hour, more than 250 Lakota were killed or fatally wounded. 25 U.S. soldiers also died, some likely from friendly fire. Survivors attempting to flee were pursued and shot. A blizzard soon covered the battlefield, and days later, the frozen bodies were buried in a mass grave. Subsequent military inquiries criticized aspects of the operation, but did not result in serious punishment. 19 Medals of Honor were awarded to soldiers involved, a decision that remains deeply controversial to this day. And that brings us to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like and help boost the video. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you soon. Bye.